Hi there. Today I'm going to make a quick video discussing about metabolism. Metabolism are all the chemical reactions that occur within living organisms to maintain life. And all of these reactions ultimately yield energy and of course other byproducts, but energy mainly in the form of ATP, which is the most important source of energy in the body. We can divide metabolism into two types: catabolism and anabolism. Catabolism is defined as the biochemical oxidation of complex substances to simpler forms with concomitant release of energy. So, there are complex substances that we take in through our diet and ingestion, and these complex substances ultimately get broken down by various chemical reactions to give energy in the form of ATP and other molecules, which ultimately become ATP. There are mainly three steps to catabolism: stage 1, 2, and 3. Stage 1 includes the breakdown of complex molecules into monomeric equivalents. So, those more complex substances like lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, through catabolic reactions are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol, glucose, and amino acids, respectively. These substrates, that means these are the substances that activate other chemical reactions, basically enter into other metabolic pathways as a beginning substrate. That means a beginning substance that comes and enters into a metabolic pathway to be further broken down to yield energy, of course, which is stage 2. In stage 2, these substances that were formed ultimately are broken down into a common ground for all of these substances, that is pyruvate and acetyl CoA. Pyruvate and acetyl CoA are very important substances because these provide substrate for Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle is what we will discuss in stage 3. Acetyl CoA, which is formed from pyruvate itself, right? I just told you that pyruvate and acetyl CoA is formed. Pyruvate ultimately then gets converted into acetyl CoA by a series of reactions. Then acetyl CoA enters into a 6 carbon cycle called the TCA cycle, that is tricarboxylic acid cycle, or simply the Krebs cycle after the name of the scientist. And ultimately, you get the formation of ATP, NADH2, GTP, and FADH2, which are all energy molecules as products. All of these molecules that I discussed, like NADH2, GTP, FADH2, ultimately get converted into ATP in the electron transport chain. Here, we are going to discuss about a simple brief summary. You can see in stage 1, the polysaccharides, which are basically your carbohydrates, they get broken down into simple sugars like monosaccharides and glucose, a specific example. Lipids get broken down, lipids refer to the fats, they get broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. Proteins to amino acids. This is basically to simplify those substances that we have taken through our diet into a more simplified form. Now, from stage 1 to stage 2, all of these molecules pool together to form a common ground, which is pyruvate and acetyl CoA. Pyruvate as well gets converted into acetyl CoA, so ultimately you get acetyl CoA. Then in stage 3, acetyl CoA then enters into the Krebs cycle, also known as citric acid cycle in the diagram. You get this acetyl CoA, which enters into a series of reactions, giving NADH2, FADH2, ADP, ATP, and which is basically all of these molecules. They enter into the electron transport chain, ETC, giving rise to the formation of electrons, protons, and most importantly, ATP. Now, anabolism is the formation of complex substances from simpler precursors. So catabolism refers to breakdown of complex to simple. Anabolism is just the exact opposite of that. It is simply the formation of complex from simpler ones. So you can, the body uses pyruvate, acetyl-CoA, metabolites of Krebs cycle, energy supply, and other reducing equivalents to form the complex substance once again. Here you can see a word, metabolites. Metabolites basically refer to intermediates of a chemical reaction pathway. So just like Krebs cycle now I discussed, is this is not a single step pathway, right? It involves many steps. So after the first step, you get a product which acts as an intermediate for the next step. So those intermediates are called metabolites. It is given the word metabolites with respect to metabolism. Now we're going to talk about the significances of both catabolism and anabolism. Catabolism forms the basis of energy production. Just like earlier discussed earlier, it gives ATP and related energy products which enter into the ETC and ultimately give more ATP. So it is forming the basis for energy production. If energy is produced, it's going to produce heat. So we say our metabolism produces heat in our body. That is due to the catabolic process. It helps in anabolism, which might sound weird because anabolism involves the synthesis. So, how is catabolism involved helping in synthesis? So, the idea behind this comes in the next point. It helps to regulate blood levels of substances, like in hyperglycemia, for example. In the situation of hyperglycemia, there is a large concentration of glucose in the bloodstream, right? If there is large concentration of glucose in the bloodstream, you are going to get the activity of insulin, right? Makes sense. So insulin is going to come and it is going to promote either the formation of glycogen so that glucose is removed from the bloodstream, or glucose is just going to enter into the cells. The idea is simply to reduce the bloodstream of its increased glucose levels. So either it's going to become glycogen or become something else, or it will enter into the cell. So in this way, it regulates the blood levels. And therefore, because it is involved in regulation, it can help in anabolism as well. This is where we are going to come into the next part where we say significance of anabolism. You can see the same point helps in catabolism because both of them are related. Then other than that, you have it helps in situations of decreased substrates. This is one of the most important significances of anabolism, is that during situations when there is a decreased substrate concentration, anabolism is very important. For example, take a look at red blood cells. Red blood cells have only one source of energy as the main substrate, which is glucose. If it does not get glucose, the RBC will not be able to synthesize energy and not be able to maintain its structure. So, having glucose in bloodstream, just enough glucose in bloodstream is very important for the RBCs. So what happens is if there is hypoglycemia, that means there is decreased level of glucose in bloodstream. Then if there is acetyl-CoA and pyruvate and other substances lying around, the body then follows a reverse, almost reverse pathway back to produce glucose. We understood that before the complex substances were there that was taken through diet, it was then broken down to simpler substances like glucose, fatty acids, glycerol, and the amino acids, and ultimately everything was pooled to acetyl-CoA in stage 2. The reverse happens in this case because there is a demand for glucose. Glucose is needed. Now the question is if acetyl-CoA is formed, why do we need glucose again? Why does RBC need glucose? The RBC needs glucose for energy. The ultimate point of all of these catabolic reactions is energy. So to get that energy, it has to reproduce the same substrate again and then break the substance down again. This is how anabolism and catabolism are related. Moving on to a small topic that is amphibolism. Amphibolism refers to a metabolic pathway which combines both catabolic and anabolic pathways. It describes that both catabolic and anabolic reactions occurring within the body are simultaneous. That means they are both occurring at the same time, depending on the demands of the body as well as demands of the cells. So, suppose a cell needs something, it is going to demand catabolic or anabolic reaction based on what it needs. If it needs energy, it is going to promote catabolic activity, and if it needs a substrate, then it's going to promote anabolic activity. And then, why are the reactions irreversible? So these catabolic and anabolic reactions, though I have told that they are just opposites of each other, they are not reversible. That means you cannot just go for catabolism and then come back to anabolism directly. It is a little bit of a complex process. The reason for this is because of the following three reasons. First is regulatory reasons. There are certain steps within these entire chemical pathways which are irreversible. They cannot be reversed, which is the reason, big reason why these reactions must be irreversible. Next is downhill. Because in catabolic reactions, energy is released. If energy is released, the system enters into a more stable configuration. Returning from a stable to an unstable configuration requires a lot of energy, right? So it is slightly not preferred. Even for anabolic reactions, for the anabolic reactions to happen, a significant energy is required. With the energy that is required, the process is active. It is against what the system's natural configuration would be, and therefore it is a unpreferred or not preferred process. And compartmentalization is the third reason. Basically, these reactions they occur in separate compartments. These occur in different separate compartments. They are not freely in the cytosol. They are not freely present within the cytosol. They are happening in separate compartments under very specific biochemical conditions. Catabolism requires an oxidative environment, and reduction requires an reductive environment. This is basically the basis of how these reactions are separated from each other and still occurring within the same cell. Isn't it amazing that although these reactions are happening within just one cell, it happens simultaneously? Thank you for watching. If you liked my video, please consider subscribing, liking, and if you have any queries, leave a comment below. Thank you again for watching.